So we're going to begin where we left off. As you can see here, I have my pattern. We're going to pretend that this is my masking tape pattern that I took off the last. I decided to make some changes to it, so redesigned the pattern and did it on this yellow paper instead. But you would take your masking tape form and begin to cut your tracing windows along the design lines. Here you can see that I have my tongue drawn onto the form. It's that dotted line there, or the dashed line. I did that to sort of represent that the tongue is laying underneath the upper. Now we fast forwarded a bit. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to get a large piece of paper and I'm going to begin to trace the individual pattern pieces onto that sheet of paper, and I want to leave enough room around the pieces that will be folded over and mirrored. You want to be very careful here to make sure you're tracing the right lines on your pattern. The cutout windows can be a little confusing at times, so just make sure that the lines that you are transferring onto the paper are the proper lines for the individual pieces. You will notice that as I trace these individual pieces, I label them, and I'll write CL, which stands for center line, on the edge that I will fold that pattern piece on. It's just a reference for later. I'm currently tracing the eye stay here. This particular design has the eye stay and this sort of, it's not quite a mud guard, but it covers part of the vamp. It's all one piece with the eye stay, and that is another piece that will be mirrored along that center line. This here is sort of my mud guard. That's what I'm going to call it. Really, it's just covering the ball of the foot. Now on to the mustache. This is another piece that will be mirrored along its center line. And of course, the whole upper. So this will serve as the main body of the upper. A lot of those other pieces will be sort of applied to this one piece. And on this piece, you want to reference all of the design lines so that you can align them to the final fabric when you're ready to pin them together or glue them together. With my design, I've decided to have unfinished edges on the tongue and the eye stay and the mud guard and the back stay. Because of this, I will not need to include a folding allowance on these pattern pieces. The reason I decided to do that is because I'm going to make those pieces out of scrap pieces of leather that I found around. So my shoe will be a combination of canvas and leather. You can do the same if you'd like. Maybe you have some scrap pieces. I have plenty of scrap pieces of leather. If you would like to go through my stash, I'd be happy to give you pieces that you find of interest. Here I am adding my 2 centimeter lasting allowance along the feather edge of the upper. I'm now adding a 5 millimeter seam allowance. And then I'm going to go around the collar, the ankle, and the throat and add a 5mm folding allowance, because here's where I'm going to want to fold over that canvas so I don't have that raw edge. And for the sake of this video, I've decided to label some of those allowances. So I have FA for folding allowance, SA for seam allowance, and LA for lasting allowance. Now hopefully you've remembered to leave enough space on your paper to fold the pattern over on its center line so that you can complete the other side. Really great cinematography here. So I designed this pattern so that I wouldn't have any overlap at the instep point, right? That is the sort of the highest point of the shoe at the top of the throat, right? There's no overlap. It just barely touches. And I did that intentionally. Your pattern may overlap, and that's okay. You'll just have to break it down into multiple pieces so that you can accommodate for that overlap. Using the pattern I just made, I'm going to now begin to draft the lining. So I'm going to do this by tracing this pattern, keeping in mind that I do have a 5mm folding allowance there. Now instead of using that 5mm as a folding allowance for the lining, we'll use that to extend up past the edge of the outer material, right? Sort of like this. This extra material on the lining extending beyond the edge of the outer material will give you a bit of space to sort of adjust it, and you'll be able to trim it later. To avoid having a single seam on the heel counter of your lining, cut the back of the pattern to eliminate that single seam on your heel. Instead, we'll have a seam on either side of your foot. Those two lines show where the fore part of the lining will end and where the counter will start. I'm subtracting 5mm seam allowance. This will make the lining smaller than the outer pattern, and you'll need that so that it fits inside of the outer material. And I'm labeling it as underlayment. Now I'm going to return to my original outer pattern. I'm going to use that to create the counter for the lining pattern. I believe I measured 9 centimeters from the heel counter center line to get this line here. But that measurement could be pretty much whatever you like. It depends on your own personal preference. Now I'm going to begin transferring that heel counter piece onto another sheet of paper. So I'm going to draw a center line here, and I'm going to match the top of my mustache to that line. Now you're going to have a bit of a curve away from the center line at the bottom, but that's okay. Just trace it, and we'll deal with that a little bit later. So now I'm going to true all these lines, make them nice and neat. And then I'm going to fold along that center line and begin to cut out the pattern. Now as I cut this out, notice that I will not cut along the curve at the bottom of the heel. Instead of cutting that paper away, I'm going to cut a window along that line because it's going to serve as a stitch line. Basically what we've created is a little dart. And now you can see how the heel counter will come together with the rest of the lining. Now we'll move on to the stiffeners. This is your heel stiffener. You use a heat gun to form it. It's basically a thermoplastic, and you can shape it to the back of the heel. Right now I'm measuring how wide I want my counter to be, and I think I ended up measuring 18 centimeters. Again, that's my own preference. You can decide how wide you want that to be. So to develop the pattern for the heel stiffener, I'm going to start with the counter piece that I made for my lining. And then I'm going to use the stiffener to sort of create the limits for which this pattern can be. It can only be as big as the material that we have. I added a little radius there, folded along the center line, and cut that piece out. There will be a heel stiffener in the sewing lab, as well as a toe puff stiffener that you will be able to use as a template for creating your stiffener patterns. Now we're moving on to the toe stiffener, or the toe puff. I'm going to use my outer pattern again to sort of define the limits of my toe puff. I believe I measured 8 centimeters there, and I'm just going to freehand a curve, and that is going to be the shape of my toe puff. Now the shape of your toe puff is totally determined by the design of your sneaker. It's up to you. And that brings us to the end of this demo. There was a lot of information covered here. Some of these processes have been covered already, and you are probably familiar with them, but others are new. And I imagine there's going to be some maybe hiccups along the way, but if you come across anything that's a little confusing, just reach out to me and we'll figure it out. Thanks for watching.